Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take an in-depth look at the newly released cooperative shooter game Payday 3 and see how it stacks up both visually and from a gameplay perspective to the previous mainline installment Payday 2. For this comparison, both games are being played on a PC, with the graphic settings pushed up as high as possible at a native 4K resolution. Upscaling solutions like DLSS have been disabled, and post-processing effects like motion blur or chromatic aberration have been disabled when possible. Alright, so let's kick this comparison off by first discussing the presentation on offer. Now, for those of you that don't already know, Payday 2 is a little over 10 years old now, and while there are a few games from that era that have held up decently enough, this one probably isn't one of them. For one, the character models are basically expressionless mannequins, mired by overly dark shadowing and improper indirect lighting, taking away from otherwise halfway decent texture maps. The characters don't seem to carry any distinct personality either, looking more like random NPCs than playable characters. Obviously, the idea here is that they're trying to blend in. They're pulling off a heist after all. But even their faces look like something you'd see randomly generated in an open-world game. Payday 3, on the other hand, improves on every aspect of its characters, with models that not only look better, but also provide a little bit more personality to the characters themselves. Wolf offers one of the clearest examples of this, as his default outfit has this new, disheveled appearance to it, with a loosened tie, rolled up sleeves tied off with zip ties, and a much thicker beard and set of eyebrows. He certainly doesn't look very incognito, and should be raising red flags to anyone paying attention. But artistically, the character here is a marked improvement over the dull, placeholder-looking model used before, and provides that extra bit of personality I feel that the previous game severely lacked. This is also a bit of an extreme example. Characters like Chains aren't quite as exaggerated. When viewed up close, there's a lot of things happening here technically too that are a big step up from the character models from before. First, we have much better, higher resolution textured surfaces for the character's skin and clothing, along with some subsurface scattering and specularity to really bring out that slight bit of sweat and granular detail on the character's forehead and cheeks. Then there's the nice addition of the hair cards for the beard, brows, and main hairline, that are a major step up from the baked-in textures and normal mapping used before. Even the random NPCs patrolling the city streets, while not particularly amazing looking, do at least sport more complex geometry and poly counts, along with more fluid animation loops than the stiff, wonky pedestrians featured prior. Again, they're not great, and a lot of times it looks as though they're missing necessary shaders and ambient occlusion layers, but they do a better job of contributing to the Payday world than their predecessors. Speaking of which, Payday 3's environments are also a marked improvement over those in Payday 2. All the textured surfaces look fantastic, with superior normal maps on objects that give them a much more clear dimension in the world. Pavement, sidewalks, bricked surfaces, they all look like you could reach out and touch them now. Whereas before, a lot of these same types of surfaces looked extremely blurry and flat. One of the better improvements I noticed were the parked vehicles along the roads, that look much better now that the individual components like the wheels, doors, and lights are being rendered individually, whereas before, they all seemed to occupy that same low-poly model, and were defined by a single ugly texture. What's more, Payday 3 also sees the addition of miscellaneous moving vehicles within the playable area, like random pedestrian cars, that add a great deal of realism to each scene, as locations in Payday 2, despite having cars driving around in the background, looked weirdly isolated and arena-like as a result. In addition to these more technical changes, the general aesthetic and artistic direction of these newer level environments feels stronger as well. Payday 2 has had 10 years of fantastic content delivered to it, raising the number of playable missions up to an impressive 70 heists. This of course wasn't always the case though, as the game initially only launched with 12 heists, many of which were fairly simple store knockovers and banks, coupled with some even smaller alternate escape levels. Payday 3, on the other hand, has only launched with 8 missions, each representative of a different mainstay style of heist in the series. There's your classic small bank, a big bank, a jewelry store, an art gallery, a truck robbery, and even a few more stealth-oriented missions like a nightclub, shipping yard, and a high-rise penthouse. Because of how complex most of these missions are, Payday 3 offers slightly more replayability right out of the gate. Though, for longtime fans of the series, dropping down from 70 to only 8 is understandably quite the step back, even if the levels are technically more complex and better detailed. Lighting is another key area of improvement, as Payday 2's old lighting design is probably the aspect that hurts its presentation the most. Payday 2 has a very unappealing, baked look to its many environments, with even the few instances of volumetric light rays intersecting with geometry too harshly. Meanwhile, specular lighting and subsurface scattering is pretty much non-existent. Ambient occlusion is severely lacking if present at all, and reflective surfaces like puddles on the street use cube maps that do the bare minimum of representing the larger surrounding area. And then there's the shadowing, that is incredibly aggressive in Payday 2, casting half of this street in almost complete darkness, greatly obscuring the details of most objects in the scene. Payday 3 doesn't necessarily render indirect lighting properly either, and it has this persistent, washed out, almost green hue that bathes the streets of New York in an almost Matrix-like appearance. Stylistically, it's serviceable, but the illusion falls apart quite a bit when you walk past groups of NPCs that glow unnaturally due to the limitation of the game's baked lighting. There's a few instances of nice volumetrics and bloom to help accentuate certain scenes, especially nighttime sequences like those at the shipping yard or the nightclub exterior. And the addition of screen space reflections to the various reflective surfaces like metal railings, glass windows, and the rain-soaked streets do a much better job than the old cube maps used before. And finally, there's the effects, that once again look quite a bit better than the old game. Glass and debris from certain surfaces shatter and splinter spectacularly during massive firefights with law enforcement. And new explosion effects from things like flashbangs, grenades, and incendiary devices light up the screen with hundreds of bright particles that, when combined with the nice new smoke alphas, help turn the game's more chaotic moments into war zones. I think it would have been nice to see a bit more destructive elements incorporated into these environments, like more realistic bullet holes and some destructible wall surfaces to help mix up the sandbox. Though there is at least some light micro-destruction added in, allowing players to chip away at certain surfaces in ways that just weren't possible before. Though again, this is all to be expected. Payday 2 came out 10 years ago, and despite receiving an impressive amount of support and additional content, it visually hasn't really improved much, if at all, since its debut. So let's instead shift gears and talk more about the actual game design itself, starting with the total revamp to the user interface and menus. One of my biggest complaints ever since Payday 2 was first made available is its needlessly clumsy and convoluted design to its many menus and submenus. The entire concept behind its design is to immerse players into the world of crime, with a secret dark web type database linking players to constantly refreshing opportunities from various contexts. The base game's content revolves primarily around crimes in and around the Washington, D.C. area, and ranges from things like simple jewelry store and armored truck robberies to large banks and art expos. Though if players want to play a specific contract that they enjoy, they can select the mission from a comprehensive list of available heists, where they can then choose to pay to access that mission using a predetermined amount of the in-game offshore account cash. It's a weird gimmick, though considering how much money players typically earn from a standard job, these fees really aren't as bad as they seem, and serve more as an accessory to the game's narrative than anything else. From here, players access a set of planning menus, where they can review pertinent notes, spend money on favors to make the job easier, and customize their loadout to fit the task at hand. With the introduction of the big bank content post-launch, Payday 2 saw the asset screen replaced with a much more robust pre-planning setup that lets players customize dead drops and escape routes, along with an interactable blueprint of the heist location itself that players can use to draw out their plans for the rest of the lobby to study, much like the old Rainbow Six planning phases from the original games. Payday 3 unfortunately doesn't see any of these aspects return. The game opts for a much more streamlined and simplified approach to its menu design that's both convenient and less immersive at the same time. The mission selection screen, for example, is just that. All 8 heists are laid out in chronological order, with story-based still image cinematics slapped down in between them to help expand on the game's narrative. Once selected, players are then placed into a matchmaking screen that, even if the player chooses to play privately by themselves, can take up to a minute at times just to boot up. Once the player is in the lobby, they can then only add one of their favorites from their inventory, or one randomized favorite that may or may not be available when the mission's selected, and swap between their created loadouts depending on the mission. There's no write-up about the location, no indication of the threat players will face, and no interactive map to plan out the approach. Next, we have the actual in-game mechanics themselves that have underwent a total revamp and overhaul in order to streamline Payday's unique concept. The game's controls, for example, have been cleaned up to feel tighter, reducing the excessive camera bob from before, and implementing more movement abilities like vaulting and sliding. Interacting with various objects in the environment is also more immersive this time around, replacing the old, long, circular interact prompt timer with a little lock-picking and safe-cracking minigame that help maintain the illusion of control throughout the course of gameplay. One of the best improvements, though, is undoubtedly the reimagined stealth action component to the game. Stealth in the Payday games, while possible, always came off as a bit of an afterthought, almost as if players weren't ever truly meant to pull it off. Players could dress down in light armor and carry smaller gear to reduce the AI's ability to detect them. And with careful coordination, a team could quickly clamp down on a group of civilians and guards before they have a chance to pull an alarm. But trying to creep up to a level's primary vault was next to impossible without being seen. Payday 3 seems to take more of the Hitman approach with its mission designs, incorporating different security tiers throughout each of its environments. There's your public space that players can freely sprint around in without fear of repercussion, as long as they don't perform any suspicious activity. Then there's the private space, where both guards and security systems will now detect the player if they're within their line of sight. And lastly, there's the secure areas, that are under strict lockdown, meaning any NPC will be alerted if they spot the player, and report their presence to the police. What's nice about this system is that players are given a little bit more flexibility if they're caught. If a guard catches a player snooping around in the private area, for example, the alarm won't just automatically trigger. The guard will actually walk up to the player first and escort them back to a public space. Additionally, if something suspicious happens, like a player fails to answer a radio of a fallen guard, a new search phase will begin, where a second guard will come to investigate the area of disturbance for a short while before returning to normal. Of course, players can only take advantage of these new features so many times, as the security team will begin to catch on and become suspicious. And if a crime is obvious enough, they won't hesitate to trigger the alarm and call the police. But it's still far more forgiving than any of the stealth options in Payday 2. In addition to these systems, stealthy players will also encounter a litany of other security barriers, including QR-locked doors that require players to find hidden smartphones or hack a code off of a wandering patrol. Then there's the classic keycards that can be swiped off security personnel or found inside random cabinets. Door codes that will force players to search for clues in the environment to unlock. Security panels that need lengthy GPS uplinks to unlock. And power nodes that need a set number of unique colored switches to be triggered. The best part is that the solutions to all these little stealth minigames are randomized each time you play. So you'll never find the same key item in the same place twice, and there's multiple codes for each door that will prevent players from just memorizing the combination. Players are also given a few more options to deal with NPCs blocking their path, including various distraction opportunities, and a new human shield ability, allowing players to easily grab an NPC and drag them to a quiet spot for a takedown. The pager system from Payday 2 also returns, requiring players to respond to a call from security if they decide to take down a guard. But players are now given a clear indication of how many calls they have left before the alarm is triggered, making stealth much easier to understand. What's more, Payday 3 also removes the limitations on zip ties and body bags, meaning players can zip tie as many characters as they like and no longer need body bags to move the bodies, allowing for better control when the situation calls for it. Now, if the alarm is raised, then the game switches over to the exciting assault phase, where the police and SWAT teams will attempt to break in and stop the heist in progress. This area of the game has received quite a few changes too, as there's now a new hostage negotiation phase introduced prior to the first assault, giving players a chance to trade any tied-up hostages for a few precious seconds to help prepare defenses. There was a hostage trade option in Payday 2 as well, but it was never incorporated in such a streamlined manner. When it comes to the combat, Payday 3 feels more or less the same. The gunplay is more polished, with weapons having a tighter feel to them, and new features like the overkill weapons add a fun element to the action, though you will notice significantly less enemy variety throughout the game than before, with only the more iconic unit types like the shields, snipers, tasers, dozers, and cloakers returning, while many of the alternate overkill and mayhem enemy types have been removed. On the bright side, enemy combatants in Payday 3 behave much more realistically than those in Payday 2. Enemies, for example, will move up in units now, sometimes stacking up behind shields, and won't spread out nearly as much as they did before. Some enemies like shields and grenaders even have new weak spots incorporated that players can use to open up opportunities and stagger the frontline assault. For players looking for that extra bit of challenge, the Overkill mode does at least feature new, constantly cycling gameplay modifiers to help mix up the experience, changing things like the level's cameras to be bulletproof, or adding in a special guard that will radio out indefinitely. Moving on, we have the player's loadout and gear setup. As you'd expect, weapons in Payday 2 are unlocked gradually as the player ranks up their player level. The higher the level, the more powerful the weapons that are made available to purchase and add to the player's arsenal. The weapon progression itself, however, is a little bit more luck-oriented, as new attachments and upgrades are often earned randomly through drawing a weapon modification card at the end of each heist. There's of course other options now, like completing a side job that enables the player to select a weapon mod of their choice, though the overall process still feels a little bit more tedious than it needs to be. Payday 3 does away with this system in favor of a much more traditional unlock format. Use a weapon and rank up that weapon's level to unlock new attachments. It still feels like a bit of a grind, as there are dozens of attachments, and each attachment type is unlocked at varying XP levels. But there's at least no more RNG involved here. Payday 3's main infamy level, on the other hand, is not the best design choice. Rather than rewarding players with XP based on quality performance in individual heists, players' level progression in Payday 3 is instead based purely around completing challenges. These challenges are typically simple things like unlocking a certain number of safes or killing a certain number of enemies. But they quickly escalate to really grindy milestone challenges like needing to play the jewelry store heist 25 times. Having these challenges boost the player's level would be nice, but making it the only source of XP seems like a really poor design decision, and one that makes trying to master certain heists with better tactics less appealing. As players rank up their main infamy level, they'll also unlock new skill points, which can be used in the reimagined skill tree to customize the player's passive and active abilities in-game. This change seems to combine aspects of both the perk decks and revamped skill system from Payday 2 into something much simpler. Though, like the reduced number of weapons and gadgets, Payday 3's available skill set isn't nearly as robust as those offered in Payday 2 at the moment, making this too feel like a slight step back. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Which version do you feel offers the best audio quality and design?
to shake the ground! Time to break bad. Get down! Get down, people!
Keep an eye on the
Down on the
civilians.
ground, people! Down, all of you! Don't you dare move! Down! Get down on the ground! Stay down, everybody!
Damn it.
Lie down.
Now we go the painful way.
Now we need to get past the gate in front of the vault.
No, I didn't know. So why didn't anybody
The gate's
tell me?
door is sealed magnetically. You have to disable the power or you won't get it open. Find
All
the
right,
circuit breaker
let's
that powers it.
No way! What's that?
Oh, God!
Look out, a sieve.
That looks awful.
Don't move!
Hold on, what's that?
Civilian.
Fucking
There goes our cover. Gonna scram.
Time for another strategy. You're gonna need thermite to burn your way into the vault. I'm sending in a chopper for an equipment drop.
Everybody listen up. This is a robbery. On the ground. Suck the floor.
I'm on approach. ETA 1 minute.
Police assault at 20.
Got it!
Buckle up. 10 seconds.
Shield!
Stay frosty.
Money.
Get yourself up before you make things worse.
I'm tracking another assault team. They'll be there in about 30 seconds.
These assholes ain't so tough! Why me? I only work here! Move up on him, God!
It's a supper! Killed the goddamn Zap.
Okay, I'm here. Get the bags in.
There's the getaway.
That's 8 bags. That's the amount we came for.
We're in the clear.
Not bad.
And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Payday 3 is a decent game, mired by some serious technical issues and a juggernaut of a reputation to uphold. I don't think anyone truly expected this new game to feature the same amount of content as its 10-year-old predecessor. But there's no denying that certain aspects of the game do feel like a slight step backwards. Enemy variety has been reduced, the current weapon selection is weak, and things like player customization, pre-planning mechanics, and overall immersion feels massively scaled down. But that's not to say Payday 3 is a bad game either. In fact, I genuinely enjoyed myself playing through its 8 heists this week, unlocking new skills and weapons, and replaying each heist in hopes of pulling off the perfect stealth-only score. But this enjoyment was greatly hampered by the game's unacceptably poor server stability at launch, coupled with the bizarre decision to not make any of the game's content available to play offline. For players looking for the ultimate heist experience, Payday 2 is still my recommendation, as it features an incredible amount of content for a fraction of the price. But if you're willing to deal with potential server instability, that's more or less been ironed out as of writing, and want to enjoy Payday 3's much better graphics, stealth action mechanics, and better level designs, then maybe Payday 3 is the better choice. But what do you guys think? Are you enjoying Payday 3, or do you still prefer Payday 2? Let me know in the comments section. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this posted every week.